I remember the exact moment my world shifted, and it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost casual, like a sentence that shouldn't have meant anything at all. "Mom, Ethan isn't your brother." Daniel said it while reaching for the salt, as if he were commenting on the weather, and for a second I thought I had misheard him, that grief or age had finally started playing tricks on my ears, because Ethan had been my brother for over 40 years, through birthdays and holidays, through the loss of our parents, through the long quiet years after my husband passed. He had been there, steady, familiar, part of the foundation of my life. So I smiled at first, a polite, confused smile, waiting for someone to correct the joke, but no one did. The dining room felt too still, the kind of stillness that presses against your chest. And when I looked up, Daniel wasn't smiling. His eyes were fixed on his plate, and Victoria, my daughter-in-law, sat across from me with her hands folded neatly, her posture perfect, her expression calm in a way that didn't feel right. Not surprised, not confused, just prepared. I glanced toward Ethan, expecting him to laugh it off, to say something reassuring, but his chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor as he stood up, his movements careful, almost rehearsed, and he didn't look at me, not even once. He just walked out of the room, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and a silence that felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady, because I have always believed that composure is the last thing anyone can take from you, and I wasn't about to lose that too. Not here, not in my own home. But Daniel didn't answer right away, and Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying me as if she were measuring how much I could handle. "It's time you knew," she said finally, her voice soft, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it, something cold and certain, like a door closing. I looked down at my hands, at the faint lines and age spots that told the story of a life spent taking care of others, and I realized that no one at that table was going to offer me comfort. No one was going to say. It was a misunderstanding, and that realization settled into me slowly, like a weight I couldn't shift. The house felt different in that moment, unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite explain, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets I had never noticed. And I found myself replaying small details I had ignored for years. The way Ethan would change the subject when I asked about our childhood. The way certain documents were always misplaced. The way Daniel and Victoria had grown closer to him in ways that didn't quite include me. I pushed my chair back carefully and stood, not because I felt weak, but because I needed space to think, and no one tried to stop me. No one called after me, which somehow hurt more than anything they could have said. I walked into the kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator grounding me just enough to breathe, and I rested my hand on the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, focusing on something real, something I knew hadn't changed, because everything else suddenly felt uncertain. I didn't cry, not then, not when the words were still echoing in my mind, because crying would have meant accepting what I had just heard, and I wasn't ready for that, not yet. Instead, I stood there in the quiet, listening to the faint murmur of voices from the dining room, voices that didn't include me anymore, and for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had never entertained before, that the life I thought I understood had been carefully constructed without my knowledge, that the people I trusted most had been keeping something from me, something significant enough to change everything. I straightened slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my blouse, a habit I had developed over decades, a small gesture of control in moments when control felt distant, and I took a deep breath, steady and measured, because if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this. Whatever the truth was, I was going to find it, piece by piece if I had to, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it changed the way I saw my family, because something had been hidden from me for far too long, and I could feel it now just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. I did not go back to the dining room that night. I stayed in the kitchen long after the voices had faded, long after I heard the front door open and close, one set of footsteps leaving, then another, until the house settled into a silence that felt unfamiliar, almost hollow, as if something essential had been quietly removed without my permission. I turned off the overhead light and stood there in the dim glow from the small lamp near the sink, letting my eyes adjust, letting my thoughts move slowly, carefully, because rushing would not help me now. For years, I had believed that stability came from routine, From the small, predictable patterns of daily life. Morning coffee at exactly 7. The soft hum of the dishwasher at night. The way Ethan would call every Sunday afternoon just to check in. But now those memories began to shift, not disappearing, but changing shape, like a photograph viewed from a different angle. I walked into the living room and sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window where I could see the oak tree in the front yard, the same tree my husband planted decades ago. And I tried to remember the first time Ethan came into our lives, not the version I had told myself, but the details I had overlooked. I closed my eyes and pictured it clearly, a warm afternoon, my husband standing in the doorway with a young man beside him, introducing him as family, explaining that circumstances had been complicated, that there were things I did not need to worry about, and I had accepted that explanation without question because I trusted him, because I believed that trust was the foundation of everything we had built together. I opened my eyes slowly and looked around the room, at the photographs lining the mantel, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, all of them including Ethan, always positioned just close enough to belong, but never quite the center, and I realized that I had never seen a single picture of him before that day. No childhood photos, no shared memories from before he arrived, just a quiet insertion into a life that was already in motion. My gaze shifted to the small cabinet near the hallway, the one where I kept important documents, papers I rarely touched unless absolutely necessary. And for a moment I hesitated, not out of fear, but because I understood that once I started looking, I would not be able to return to the comfort of not knowing. I stood up anyway and walked toward it, each step steady, deliberate, and I opened the drawer, the familiar scent of paper and time rising up to meet me. I sorted through the folders carefully, my fingers moving with practiced precision, property records, insurance documents, old tax returns, all organized in a way that had always made sense to me, until now. Then I found a folder that felt slightly out of place, thinner than the others, tucked toward the back as if it had been placed there quickly, without much thought, and I pulled it out, setting it on the table in front of me. I did not open it right away. Instead, I rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of something I could not yet define, and I took a slow breath, reminding myself that whatever was inside, it was simply information, nothing more, nothing less. But even as I told myself that, I could not ignore the quiet certainty building inside me, the sense that the life I had lived, the relationships I had trusted, had been shaped by decisions made without my knowledge, by conversations I was never part of. I finally opened the folder and glanced at the first page, not reading every word, just enough to notice the dates, the names, the inconsistencies that did not quite align with the story I had been given, and I felt something shift again, not breaking this time, but settling into place. I closed the folder gently and leaned back in my chair, staring at nothing in particular, because the truth was beginning to take form, not fully clear yet, but undeniable, and for the first time since that sentence at the dinner table, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a simple family secret. This was something that had been carefully constructed over years, and I had been the only one who did not know. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to rest. It kept moving through memories with a kind of quiet precision, lining them up, examining them from angles I had never considered before, and by morning, the house felt colder, not in temperature, but in truth, as if something invisible had shifted its place within these walls. I made my coffee the way I always did, measuring carefully, pouring slowly, letting the routine anchor me, because routine has a way of reminding you who you are when everything else feels uncertain. And as I stood there holding the warm mug between my hands, I made a decision, not emotional, not reactive, but deliberate. I was going to verify everything. I carried the folder from the night before to the dining table and opened it again, this time with more attention, reading line by line, noticing the dates first, because dates do not lie, they do not bend to emotion or memory, and what I saw did not match the story I had lived. Documents that suggested legal arrangements made years before Ethan ever appeared in my life. Signatures that looked familiar but were placed in contexts I did not remember agreeing to, and transfers of authority that had been executed quietly, efficiently, without ever crossing my awareness. I set the papers down and reached for my phone, scrolling through old contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. Mr. Harrison, my late husband's attorney, a man who had always spoken carefully, choosing his words with intention, and for a moment I considered whether I should call him, whether I was ready to hear whatever he might say, but hesitation no longer served me. So I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. He answered on the third ring, his voice older, slower, but still steady, and when I told him who I was, there was a pause, not long, but noticeable, the kind of pause that carries weight. And then he said my name in a tone that suggested he had been expecting this moment, though perhaps not this soon. I asked him a simple question, one that had been forming in my mind since the night before. Can you tell me about the documents my husband signed regarding Ethan? And the silence on the other end stretched just enough to confirm that I was no longer asking the wrong questions. He did not rush his response. He never had. And when he finally spoke, he did not offer explanations. He offered facts, careful, measured, each one placed deliberately, like pieces on a board I had never realized I was part of, and with each sentence, the outline of something much larger began to take shape. I did not interrupt him. I did not react. I simply listened, because understanding requires patience, and patience has always been something I possess in abundance. When the call ended, I set the phone down gently and looked back at the papers spread across the table, but now they were no longer confusing. They were clear in a way that felt almost unsettling, as if clarity itself carried a certain weight. I stood up and walked to the hallway mirror, studying my reflection for a moment, not searching for answers, but confirming something within myself, that I was still steady, still in control, still capable of handling whatever came next, and I realized that the woman looking back at me was not the same one who had sat at that dinner table the night before. She was quieter, more focused, less willing to accept things at face value. I returned to the table and began organizing the documents, stacking them neatly, aligning the edges, a small act of order in the middle of something that had been anything but orderly. And as I did, one thought settled into place with complete certainty. This had not been an accident. This had not been confusion or miscommunication. This had been planned, structured, maintained over years with careful attention, and I had been the only one left outside of it. I closed the folder and placed it back into the cabinet, not to hide it, but to preserve it, because I would need it again, and as I turned off the kitchen light and prepared to step into the day, I understood something that changed everything. The truth was no longer something I needed to search for. It was already there, and now, it was simply a matter of deciding what I was going to do with it. By late afternoon, the house had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but I no longer experienced that rhythm the same way. Every sound seemed more deliberate, every silence more meaningful, as if I had stepped into a version of my life where nothing could be taken at face value anymore, and I found myself moving through each room with a different awareness, noticing details I had overlooked for years. I paused in the hallway outside the study, the door slightly ajar, the same way it had often been when my husband was alive, and for a moment I hesitated, not because I was afraid to enter, but because I understood that this room, more than any other, held pieces of a truth I had never been invited to see. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, the air carrying that familiar scent of old books and polished wood, a scent that used to comfort me, but now felt layered with something I could not quite name. The desk was exactly as I remembered it, neat, organized, every item in its place, as if time had decided to preserve this space while everything else quietly shifted around it. And I walked over to it, running my fingers lightly along the surface, remembering the countless evenings I had stood here talking to him while he worked, trusting that whatever he was handling, it was for us, for our family, for the life we had built together. I opened the top drawer carefully, not expecting to find anything obvious, but knowing that sometimes the most important things are hidden in plain sight, and inside I found a small stack of envelopes, unmarked, their edges slightly worn, as if they had been handled often but never fully revealed. I took one and opened it, sliding the contents out with steady hands, and what I saw was not shocking in a dramatic sense, but it was precise, deliberate, consistent with everything I had begun to understand: financial statements, account summaries, records of transfers that spanned years, all connected by a pattern that was impossible to ignore once you allowed yourself to see it. I set the papers down and reached for another envelope, then another, each one adding another layer, another confirmation, until there was no room left for doubt, only clarity, quiet and undeniable. I stepped back from the desk and looked around the room again. But this time I was not seeing it as a place of shared history. I was seeing it as a place where decisions had been made without me, where conversations had taken place that I was never part of, and that realization did not bring anger. It brought something else, something steadier, more focused. I closed the drawer and turned toward the window, the late afternoon light filtering through the curtains in a way that cast long, soft shadows across the floor, and I stood there for a moment, letting that light settle around me, grounding me in the present, reminding me that while the past could not be changed, the future was still something I could shape. When I left the study, I did not rush. I did not look back. I simply closed the door behind me and walked down the hallway with the same measured steps I had taken all day, because I understood now that reacting quickly would serve no purpose, that whatever had been constructed over years would require patience to unravel. As I reached the living room, I noticed my phone resting on the side table, and after a brief pause, I picked it up and scrolled through my contacts once more, not searching this time, but selecting with intention, and I tapped on Daniel's name, holding the phone loosely as it rang, knowing that this conversation would not be about confrontation, not yet. It would be about observation, about listening, about allowing him to reveal more than he intended without ever realizing it. When he answered, his voice carried a hint of hesitation, subtle, but present, and I spoke calmly, evenly, as if nothing had changed, asking him simple questions about his day, about work, about ordinary things, and I listened carefully to every response, not just to what he said, but to what he avoided, to the pauses, the shifts in tone, the small inconsistencies that would have gone unnoticed before but now stood out clearly. I ended the call without pressing him, without pushing for answers, because I no longer needed him to tell me the truth directly. I could see it forming in the spaces between his words, and as I placed the phone back on the table, one thought settled into place with quiet certainty. They believed I was still in the dark, still unaware, still trusting, and for now, I was willing to let them believe that. Because sometimes the most effective way to understand a situation is to step back and watch it unfold, and I had spent enough years being unaware. Now it was time to observe. The next morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next, and I moved through my routine without hesitation, preparing breakfast, opening the curtains, letting the sunlight fill the rooms that had once felt so familiar. Because I understood now that maintaining normalcy was not denial, it was strategy. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy blouse and slacks, nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention, and before leaving the house, I paused in front of the mirror again, not to check my appearance, but to confirm that the calm expression I wore was genuine, because if I was going to move forward, I needed to be steady in more than just action. I needed to be steady in presence. The bank was only a 10-minute drive, a route I had taken countless times over the years. Yet that morning every turn seemed more significant, every passing landmark sharper, as if clarity had extended beyond my thoughts into the world around me. When I walked inside, the familiar scent of polished floors and quiet efficiency greeted me, and I approached the counter with the same composed demeanor I had carried all morning, requesting access to my accounts in a tone that suggested nothing unusual, nothing urgent, because urgency often raises questions, and I was not ready for questions yet. The young woman at the desk smiled politely and guided me through the process, her voice steady, professional, and as she pulled up the records, I watched the screen carefully, not searching for anything specific, but allowing the information to present itself in its own time. Numbers have a way of revealing patterns that words often conceal, and it did not take long before I began to see it. Small transactions at first, subtle, almost insignificant on their own, but consistent, regular, forming a sequence that stretched back further than I expected, and as I followed that sequence, the amounts grew larger, more deliberate, less easy to dismiss. I did not react, not outwardly. I simply asked for printed statements, my voice even, my posture unchanged, and the young woman complied without hesitation, unaware that each page she handed me was confirming something I had only begun to suspect. I thanked her, gathered the documents neatly, and walked out of the bank with the same measured pace I had entered, because there is a certain power in leaving a place without drawing attention, in carrying information quietly rather than announcing its significance. When I returned home, I placed the documents on the dining table and reviewed them again, this time without the limitations of a screen, tracing the dates, the account numbers, the authorizations, and there it was, unmistakable, a pattern of access and control that did not belong to me, signatures that mirrored my own but were not mine, approvals granted without my knowledge, and at the center of it all, a connection that led back, not just to Ethan, but to Daniel as well. I leaned back in my chair and allowed that realization to settle, not as a shock, but as a confirmation, because the pieces had already begun to align. This was simply the final shape they formed. I thought about the conversation from the night before, about the way Daniel had avoided my eyes, about the calm certainty in Victoria's voice, and I understood now that this was not a recent development. This was something that had been building quietly over time, something they believed would remain unnoticed indefinitely. I gathered the papers into a single stack and tapped them lightly against the table to align the edges, a small, deliberate motion that brought a sense of order to what had once felt chaotic, and I placed them inside a new folder, separate from the others, because this was no longer part of the past. This was something current, something active. As I closed the folder, I allowed myself a single, measured breath, not to release tension, but to acknowledge what I now knew with complete certainty, that the people I had trusted most had not only hidden the truth from me, they had acted on that truth in ways that directly affected my life, my security, my future, and yet, despite that understanding, I did not feel anger, not in the way one might expect. What I felt was something quieter, more controlled, a clarity that sharpened my focus, rather than clouded it. I stood up, carried the folder to the cabinet, and placed it carefully inside, not as a way of putting it away, but as a way of preparing it, because I knew this was not the end of anything. This was the beginning of something far more deliberate, and as I turned off the light and stepped back into the living room, one thought remained steady and unshaken. They believed they had already secured their position, but they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I would never look closely enough to see what they were doing, and now that I had, everything had changed. That evening, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I set the table for dinner as if nothing had changed, as if the events of the past 2 days had not shifted the ground beneath my feet, and I moved with the same care I always had, placing each plate precisely, aligning the silverware, folding the napkins in the simple way I had used for years, because routine, when used correctly, can be a form of control. I sent a message to Daniel, brief and calm, asking him and Victoria to come by for dinner. No explanation, no urgency, just an invitation that felt ordinary on the surface, and he responded quickly, almost too quickly, agreeing without question, which told me more than any hesitation would have. When they arrived, I greeted them at the door with a small smile, the same one I had worn countless times before, and I stepped aside to let them in, watching carefully as they moved through the house, their eyes scanning the room in subtle ways they likely believed I would not notice, checking, assessing, confirming that everything appeared as it should. Victoria complimented the smell of the food, her voice warm, practiced, and Daniel asked how I had been, his tone carrying that same careful neutrality I had begun to recognize, and I answered them both in kind, polite, composed, offering nothing that would suggest I had uncovered anything at all. We sat down at the table, the same table where everything had shifted just nights before, and for a few moments, the conversation remained light, predictable, centered on work, on schedules, on the kinds of details people use to fill space when they are avoiding something larger, and I allowed it, because there is value in letting people settle into their roles, in giving them the comfort of believing they are still in control of the narrative. Then, as Daniel reached for his glass, I spoke, not loudly, not abruptly, but with a calm that drew his attention immediately. I went to the bank this morning, I said, my voice even, my gaze steady, and I watched the smallest shift in his posture, the brief tightening in his shoulders, the way his hand paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing its movement, and Victoria's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened, just slightly, just enough to confirm that the words had landed exactly where I intended them to. I did not continue right away, I allowed the silence to stretch, because silence has a way of inviting people to reveal themselves. And Daniel was the first to speak, asking a simple question: why? As if the act itself required justification, as if I needed a reason to review my own accounts. I offered him a small, almost thoughtful smile. "It has been a while," I said, and that was all. Nothing more, nothing that could be challenged directly, nothing that could be dismissed either. The conversation resumed, but it was different now, less fluid, more cautious, each word placed with greater care, and I listened, not to the content, but to the rhythm, to the subtle hesitations, to the way Victoria occasionally glanced at Daniel, the way he avoided meeting my eyes for more than a second at a time, and with each passing moment, the dynamic at the table became clearer, not because they said anything revealing, but because of what they did not say. After dinner, as I cleared the plates, Victoria stood to help, her movements smooth, composed, and as we stood side by side in the kitchen, she spoke quietly, almost casually. "You have always been very trusting," she said, not as an accusation, not as a compliment, but as a statement, and I rinsed the dishes slowly, considering her words before responding. "Trust is built over time," I said, my tone just as calm, and I felt, rather than saw, the brief pause in her movement, the slight shift in her breathing, the recognition that I was not as unaware as I appeared. When they left later that evening, Daniel hugged me lightly, his gesture brief, careful, and Victoria offered the same composed smile she had arrived with. But as the door closed behind them and the house returned to silence once more, I stood there for a moment, replaying every detail, every glance, every word, and I understood something with absolute clarity. They were beginning to sense that something had changed, that I was no longer the same person they had been able to manage so easily. And yet they did not know how much I knew. Not yet. And that uncertainty, that space between what they believed and what was true, that was where my advantage lay, and I intended to use it. The following morning, I did not rush into action. I did not confront anyone. I did not reveal what I had discovered. Instead, I did something far more effective. I began to watch more closely than I ever had before, not just what was said, but what was done, because actions, when observed without interruption, have a way of exposing intentions far more clearly than words ever could. I spent the early hours of the day going through the house as I normally would, watering the plants, opening the windows, letting in the soft morning air, but beneath that routine, my attention was sharper, more deliberate, and I found myself noticing patterns that had once blended into the background of my life. Around mid-morning, I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway, and I did not need to look to know who it was. Ethan had always arrived without calling, always comfortable, always certain of his place here, and I remained where I was in the living room, seated with a book open in my lap, waiting, because timing, I had learned, was just as important as information. The front door opened, and his footsteps echoed lightly through the hallway, steady, unhurried, and when he stepped into the room, he paused for just a moment, as if assessing something, as if trying to read the space in a way I had never noticed before. "You are home," he said, his tone casual, but there was a slight tension beneath it, something controlled, something measured, and I looked up at him with the same calm expression I had worn the night before. "It is my house," I replied simply, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when a familiar dynamic shifts, even slightly. He moved further into the room, glancing briefly toward the hallway that led to the study, then back to me, and I followed that glance without turning my head, storing it away, another small detail. To add to the growing pattern, "I stopped by to check on a few things," he said, and I nodded slowly, closing the book in my lap with deliberate care. "Of course," I said, my voice even, offering no resistance, because resistance would have revealed too much too soon, and I was not interested in forcing anything. I was interested in understanding everything. He walked past me then, his steps slightly quicker than before, and I listened as he moved through the house, opening doors, pausing, closing them again, each movement precise, purposeful, and I remained seated, allowing him the freedom to act without interference, because freedom often leads to exposure. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was composed, but there was something different now, something tighter, as if he had not found exactly what he expected, and he sat across from me, leaning back slightly, attempting to reclaim a sense of ease that no longer felt natural. "Everything looks good," he said, and I gave a small nod, as if that was all that needed to be said, but the silence that followed stretched longer than usual, and I could feel the shift between us, subtle, but undeniable. After a moment, I spoke, not directly, not confrontationally, but with the same quiet precision I had used the night before. "I have been reviewing some of the accounts," I said, and this time, the reaction was clearer, his posture stiffened slightly, his gaze sharpening in a way he could not fully conceal, and for the first time, I saw it, not the version of him I had accepted for years, but the version that existed beneath it, the one that calculated, that measured, that responded not with emotion, but with strategy. "That is not something you need to worry about," he replied, his tone still controlled, but firmer now, less casual, and I held his gaze steadily, allowing the weight of my silence to settle between us before responding. "I decide what I need to worry about," I said quietly, and the words were simple, but they carried something new, something he had not heard from me before. He did not argue, not immediately. Instead, he leaned back again, studying me in a way that mirrored my own observation, as if he were trying to determine how much had changed, how much I understood, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because sometimes the most revealing exchanges happen without words at all. Eventually, he stood, smoothing his jacket as if resetting himself, and he offered a brief, polite remark about returning later, about checking in again, but the ease that had once defined his presence was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more aware. I watched him leave the house, the door closing softly behind him, and I remained where I was, not moving, not reacting outwardly, but inside. Everything had aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. He was not just part of this. He was central to it. And now, for the first time, he understood that I was no longer simply observing from the outside. I was beginning to step into the space they had carefully controlled, and that realization, I knew, would change the way they moved from this point forward, because once someone realizes they are being watched, they can never return to the comfort of acting unseen. That night, I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for a book. I simply sat in the quiet of the living room and allowed my thoughts to move freely, because there was no longer any reason to avoid them, no reason to soften what I now understood. And as the hours passed, the past began to reorganize itself in a way that felt almost inevitable. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes rest on the photographs along the wall, each one capturing a moment I had once believed to be genuine. But now, each image carried a different weight, a different meaning, and I began to see what had always been there, just beyond my attention. There was a picture from a summer barbecue years ago, Ethan standing slightly apart from the rest of us, smiling, but not quite connected, and I remembered how he had arrived late that day, offering a simple explanation that I had accepted without question, and now that memory shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that his presence had always been carefully managed, always slightly outside the center, yet never distant enough to raise concern. I closed my eyes and let another memory surface, a holiday gathering where Daniel and Victoria had spent most of the evening in quiet conversation with Ethan, their heads close together, their voices low, and I had dismissed it at the time as nothing more than family closeness. But now I understood it differently, as coordination, as alignment, as something intentional that I had simply chosen not to examine. The realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity, a steady unfolding of understanding that replaced confusion with structure, and I found myself tracing back through years, identifying moments that no longer felt random, decisions that had seemed small at the time, but now formed a pattern, changes in financial arrangements, subtle shifts in authority, the gradual way in which certain responsibilities had been taken from me under the guise of convenience or support. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, moving from room to room, not searching for anything specific, but allowing the space itself to guide my thoughts, because this house had been the setting for everything, every conversation, every decision, every quiet adjustment that had led to where I now stood. When I reached the study, I paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, and I stepped inside, turning on the small lamp near the desk, casting a warm, contained light that illuminated only what was necessary, leaving the rest in shadow. I sat down and placed my hands on the surface of the desk, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something tangible, something real, and I began to speak softly, not to anyone present, but to the silence itself, as if organizing my thoughts into something that could be understood clearly. This was planned, I said quietly, and hearing the words out loud did not make them heavier, it made them precise. I reviewed everything again in my mind, the documents, the accounts, the conversations, the reactions, and each element fit into place without resistance, without contradiction, forming a complete picture that no longer required interpretation. I stood up slowly and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall back into darkness, because I no longer needed to search here. I had already found what I came for, and as I walked back into the hallway, I felt something settle within me, not resignation, not defeat, but a kind of calm resolve that comes when uncertainty is replaced with understanding. I returned to the living room and paused by the window, looking out at the quiet street, the familiar houses, the soft glow of porch lights in the distance, and I realized that while everything around me appeared unchanged, I was no longer the same person standing inside this moment. I did not feel the need to confront them immediately. I did not feel the need to demand explanations, because explanations were no longer necessary. I had already seen enough, understood enough, and what remained was not a question of what had happened, but a question of what I would do next. I turned away from the window and walked toward the cabinet where I had placed the documents, opening it briefly, not to review them again, but to confirm their presence, to remind myself that everything I needed was already within reach. And as I closed it once more, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, not out of satisfaction, but out of certainty, because they believed they had shaped the outcome. They believed they had controlled the narrative, but they had not accounted. For one thing, they had not accounted for the moment when I would finally see everything clearly, and now that I did, the balance had already begun to shift, even if they did not realize it yet. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had not slept, but because my mind had already settled into something steady, something clear, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel like I was reacting to events. I felt like I was stepping into control of them. I moved through the house with quiet purpose, preparing my coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light fill the space just as I always had. But this time, every action felt intentional, as if I were setting the stage rather than simply living within it. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple and composed, and before leaving, I walked to the cabinet and took out the folder, holding it for a moment, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as something solid, something undeniable, and then I placed it into my bag without hesitation. The drive to Mr. Harrison's office was familiar, the same route I had taken years ago, but it felt different now, sharper, more defined, as if each turn marked a step forward rather than a continuation of the past. And when I arrived, I did not pause. I walked inside with the same calm presence I had carried through everything else, because hesitation no longer had a place in what I was about to do. He greeted me with that same measured expression, the kind that reveals little but understands much, and I sat across from him, placing the folder on the desk between us, opening it slowly, not for him, but for myself, as if confirming once more that everything inside was real, that everything I had seen and understood was grounded in fact. I want everything reviewed, I said, my voice steady, my tone clear, and he nodded without question, because there are moments when explanation is unnecessary, when the intention is evident in the way something is said rather than what is said. He began going through the documents, page by page, his expression tightening slightly as he moved through them, and I watched quietly, not seeking reassurance, not needing confirmation, because I already knew what he would find. I had already seen it for myself. When he finally looked up, there was no surprise in his eyes, only recognition, and that was enough. We spoke then, not about emotions, not about betrayal, but about process, about steps, about corrections, about the ways in which something constructed could be carefully dismantled, and I listened, asking only what was necessary, focusing not on what had been done, but on what could be done next. When I left his office, the air outside felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if the uncertainty that had once surrounded me had finally lifted, and I stood there for a moment before getting into my car, allowing that clarity to settle fully, because it was not something I intended to lose again. When I returned home, the house was quiet, exactly as I had left it, but it no longer felt like a place where things happened to me. It felt like a place where I could decide what happened next, and I set my bag down on the table, removing the folder and placing it carefully in front of me. I did not open it again. I did not need to, because what it contained was no longer just information, it was direction. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, the same view I had seen for years. And I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not out of relief, but out of readiness, because everything that had been hidden, everything that had been managed without me, was now within my understanding, and that changed everything. I did not feel the need to call Daniel. I did not feel the need to confront Ethan or question Victoria, because confrontation would come in time, but not yet, not until everything was in place, not until every detail had been accounted for, because this was no longer about reacting to what they had done, this was about deciding what I would do in response. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table, resting my hand lightly on the folder, and for a moment, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth of what had happened, not with anger, not with regret, but with clarity, because clarity is what allows you to move forward without hesitation. They believed they had already secured their outcome. They believed they had positioned everything in their favor, and for a long time, they had been right. But that time had passed, and as I stood there in the quiet of my home, I understood something with complete certainty. They were still playing the game they had created, but I was no longer playing by the rules they had written, and that was the one thing they had never prepared for.